gospel today comes from the Gospel of John, and there we read, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you I saw you under a fig tree? You'll see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you'll see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." Let us pray. Lord, may your words only be spoken and your words only heard. We do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. Well, today is the second day in our sermon series, And Justice for All, and it is good to see everybody here. Appreciate you coming back. Hope you'll come back the next 2 weeks as we continue on with this series, because as we said last week, the only way that there really will be justice for all is if we all do our part. And what we want to think about today is seeing greater things, having a vision of greater things, and we want to use the gospel itself as our jumping off point. In that story there, we hear Jesus' interaction with Nathanael. You just heard it. Philip sees Jesus, believes Jesus is the Messiah, gets his brother Nathanael says, "I found the Messiah, he's from Nazareth." Nathanael says, "Man, there's nothing good that comes from Nazareth. What good could there be? How could he be the Messiah?" And Philip says, "Come and see." Jesus meets Nathanael, says, "I see you're a person who there's no deceit in you." And for some reason that we don't know, this touches Nathanael and he says, "How do you know me, Jesus?" And Jesus says, "Well, I saw you under the fig tree." And all of a sudden everything changes for Nathanael, and he makes his profuse confession of Jesus as God's Son. And Jesus says, "Well, you think that's something? You ain't seen nothing yet, bud. You're going to see much greater things than that." And this ends up being a story. It's a playful little story, and what's going on there might not be obvious to it. It might not be immediately obvious to us. So it starts, as we just said, with Nathanael hearing Jesus from Nazareth and saying, "Man, what good can come from Nazareth? Nazareth is a bunch of simpletons and bumpkins, and so this guy can't possibly be the Savior." But he gives Jesus a shot, goes and meets him, and when he meets Jesus, Jesus says, "In you there's no deceit," and part of the reason we know that is he just spoke his mind about people from Nazareth. And so Jesus says, "There's no deceit in you." And Nathanael says, "How do you know this about me? I saw you under the fig tree." And again, somehow this has huge impact on Nathanael. Why? We don't know. We really don't know. There was some private exchange that went on there. It meant something, obviously, well, it wasn't a private exchange, but there was something that the two of them understood in private that had a huge impact on Nathanael. It may be that a fig tree was a reference to a person's home. It's sometimes used that way in the Old Testament, and so what Jesus was saying is, "I've seen you at home, Nathanael. I've seen you in your private life. I know the kind of person you really are." And Nathanael feels like he is seen, and this so touches him that he professes Jesus as Savior. It may be that in the hot climate of Israel over in the Middle East, it may be that a fig tree was a spot that provided shade, and so when people, under the fig tree, the shade of the fig tree is a place where people often pray. And it may be that therefore Nathanael was praying under the fig tree, and when he says, "You are an Israelite in whom there is no guile," Israel was the name that was given to Jacob, who was a man who was full of deceit. And Jacob wrestled with God and worked some things out with God, and this wrestling with God, that his name was changed from Jacob, deceitful one, to Israel. And so it may be that when he says, you are an Israelite in whom there is no guile, he's saying you are an Israelite in whom there is no Jacob. And it may be a reference to the fact that what Nathanael was doing was struggling in prayer under the fig tree. Jesus sees this again, recognizes it. It touches Nathanael. He professes Jesus as Christ. We don't really know, but those are two possible interpretations. But whatever it is, it really touches him, and he makes this again, very outgoing profession that you are Lord. And Jesus then says, "This impresses you? This little thing that I saw you under a fig tree, and it's sort of a playful little implication here. I think Jesus is being a bit playful. He's saying, you thought I was a simpleton and a bumpkin because I came from Nazareth? And yet, this little thing impresses you? Who's the simpleton and bumpkin now? You're going to see a lot bigger things than this. This is nothing. And so what he's doing is he's expanding in a playful way. He's expanding Nathanael's mind to possibilities, to imagining greater things than he has ever seen. And when he follows Jesus, he is going to see greater things. He is going to be introduced to things that are greater than he ever imagined or thought about. And the effect of this reading, again, in what I think is a playful way, is that it says, and now all of you simpletons, and this simpleton, all of you bumpkins. Now, will you be delivered from your simple-mindedness? Will you be delivered from your bumpkinness? And clearly, I need to be delivered from my bumpkinness because I don't think bumpkinness is even a word, right? So, I mean, and again, we don't think of ourselves that way, right? I would venture to guess not many of us think of ourselves as simpletons and bumpkins. We think of ourselves as sophisticated, erudite, well put together, intellectual. But so often what occupies our time, energy, and attention are lesser things, not greater things. And so in that sense, Jesus is inviting us to be delivered from our lesser lives, our simple lives, our, if you will, our bumpkin lives, and to be a part of something so much bigger, so much greater. Now, as it turns out, a person who also spoke a great deal about this, who picked up this theme, was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And though he always considered himself a preacher, first and foremost, he considered himself a preacher. Our day and age has sort of remade him a little bit, where they sort of downplay his preaching origins. But if you read anything of him, with prayers, sermons, speeches, they are just filled through and through with biblical references, with confessions of faith in Jesus and his hope that Jesus is the one that's going to change everything. And one of the things that concerned him, even in his day, decades ago, was the way that people were losing their vision for greater things and giving their life to lesser things. And so he said, for instance, you all got cars. You know, everybody's got cars. And he said, and now, because people have cars, because they have the means, what they've started to do is drive to the beach on Sunday afternoon instead of going to the church on Sunday morning. And he said, now, people don't do this consciously. But unconsciously, they're turning their backs from God. And the word that he said is what people do, and I think he was the one who first started saying this, is what people do is they pay lip service to God, but they don't pay God life service. What he said is when people in church, they affirm certain things with their lips, but the way they live their lives deny what they affirm with their lips. They pay lip service, not life service. And frankly, that might be something you want to write down. You know, that might be something you want to put on a mirror or a dashboard, and just during the week think lip service or life service. What's the difference between the two? Which one am I? Am I really paying life service, or is mine lip service? And so he said people get cars, you know, they go to the beach, they stop coming to church, you know. And then he says people get TV sets. And again, TV sets were something normal. And he says what happens is people get caught up in the screen. And so they start watching TV and they stop coming to church. And that was before we even had computers with the whole world at our hands, or smartphones with the whole world at our hands, where you can go anywhere and see anything. And he said, people don't, it's not conscious, but this is what people do. And he said that when people do these things, he said these things in and of themselves, they're not bad, but when these things replace God, he said they become injurious. They cause injury. And if you think about Martin Luther King, who is consumed with this vision of greater things, justice for all, and he sees all these people who just aren't giving it much of a thought because they're caught up in the luxuries of their lives, the convenience of their lives. Imagine how frustrating that must have been for him. Imagine how frustrating that was for Jesus. And so he makes this statement, and he makes this, again, this is made decades ago. He refuses to let his vision be dumbed down. In a world and a culture where people are just being dumbed down every way, and that has only escalated over the decades, he refused to let his vision of God, of what God is doing, of what he can do, he refuses to let it be dumbed down. And this is what he says, written decades ago, but I think all the more powerful today. He says, I'm not going to put my ultimate faith in things. I'm not going to put my ultimate faith in gadgets and conveniences. As a young man with most of my life ahead of me, I decided early on to give my life to something eternal and absolute. And let's just stop here for a minute. Think of yesterday. What did you think about yesterday? You know, what did you see yesterday? We're talking about seeing greatly. What occupied your attention, your focus? Did you think about eternal and absolute things? I'm being quite literal. Did I think about eternal and absolute things? Or was your day yesterday, was my day yesterday filled with lesser things? This is the question he's asking. And so he says, I decided early on to give my life to something eternal and absolute, not to these little gods that are here today and gone tomorrow, but to the God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Not in the little gods that can be with us in a few moments of prosperity, no matter how good those moments are, but in the God who walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death. And for any of us who have lost somebody, boy, we just know how important that is. The God who causes us to fear no evil. I'm not going to put my ultimate faith in little gods that can be destroyed in an atomic age. And those fears have resurfaced, haven't they? But God who has been our help in ages past, and our hope for years to come, and our shelter in time of storm, and our eternal home. That's the God I'm putting my faith in. And he says, and he goes on to say, and he preaches a very specific sermon on this. He says, it's not until people are done with these lesser things that they will, and begin to see greater things, that they begin to look at things different than what they normally look at, that they stop looking at cars and things and social standing, that the church will ever be able to be a church. And again, he says quite specifically, he says if a church is going to be a church, if people are really going to follow Jesus, if you're not going to follow Jesus, he's not concerned with that. But for the people who really in some way, shape, or form want to follow Jesus, it might be as God, which is how I follow Jesus. It might simply be Jesus as an outstanding example of a moral teacher. But he says if people are really going to follow Jesus, there's 3 things they have to do. There's no choice in this. These are not optional. And he says when churches don't do this, churches become country clubs. And he says what they'll do is they'll pick a single thing that'll define them. Maybe it'll be race, maybe it'll be social economic standing, maybe it will be biblical literalist, maybe it'll be devotion to liturgy, but all these things become ways of excluding somebody. He says that's how you know a church has become a country club, when in some way, shape, or form it begins to exclude people. And then he says, and the other thing the church becomes is just a source of entertainment. And boy, was he prophetic on that one. But he said, for a church to really be a church, for it not just to be a country club, an in-group, for it not just to be something that entertains us, that occupies us, and a whole bunch of things that occupy us, but it has to do 3 things. He says the very first thing it must do is it must bind up the brokenhearted. And what he says, and again, he says this very specifically, he says, no one can lose a loved one. No one can lose a mother or father, sister, brother, or child without ending up with a broken heart. And no one can. And he says when people come to church, if the church does not give people hope, a church is not a church. And he said these lesser things in those moments, when these lesser things are never going to bring a person hope who needs hope. And so he says we got to proclaim that Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe in me. And in the midst of all this that's going on, in some way find the peace that passes understanding. He says we got to preach that Jesus says, come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. But see, if we're caught up in lesser things, our own little lives, our cars, our trips, our this, our that, we're not even going to see the needs of other people. We're not going to be the church that God called us to be, that Martin Luther King Jr. called us to be. So the second thing a church absolutely has to do, a church must do, if a church is going to be a church, is a church must preach deliverance. And he says the very mission of the church is to set people free. And of course, he's got Jesus dead on. I mean, that's what Jesus said. Right before Jesus goes into his public ministry, Jesus takes a passage from Isaiah, and that passage from Isaiah is all about setting people free from the various things that hold people captive. And he says with incredulity, he says there are churches that aren't concerned with freeing people from prejudice, from bigotry, from ignorance, from misbehaviors. And he said there are churches where people want to speak out on these things, but they're afraid to. And there are churches that don't confront that fear and let people stay silent. He says churches, if a church is going to be a church, it has to be in the process of setting people free. And it shocks him that in churches there are people who swear devotion to man-made systems. And who swear identity is something other than Jesus because he sees only Jesus being able to deliver us. And so this idea, sometimes you've seen this, it started with Christians on the right, and then it became Christians on the left. The second you add right or left to Christian, you've sworn devotion to a man-made system. And in essence, betrayed Jesus because Jesus calls all of us to something more fun. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. is getting at. We've got to be freed from this kind of thinking that's out there that becomes so normal that we think it's okay in here. And he goes, and he realizes there's going to be a price to this. He realizes people aren't going to like this. He realizes that people are going to be upset by this. And he says, and again, he doesn't mince words. He says, the God I serve and the God that called me to preach told me that every now and then I'm going to have to go to jail. Every now and then I'll have to agonize and suffer for the freedom of God's children. I may even have to die for it. And what's the interesting thing is that people like Martin Luther King, people like Jesus, it wasn't so much that people killed them, it's that they chose for themselves a path early on and they knew where that path would go and they were willing to accept it. That's what he says right here. He sees where this is leading. I may even have to die for it, and he does. But if that's necessary, I'd rather follow the guidelines of God than to follow the guidelines of people. The church is called to set free those that are captive, to set free that those are victims of slavery, of segregation and discrimination, those who are caught up in slavery and fear and prejudice and ignorance. So this is what the church must do, and if a church doesn't do this, if it's concerned with lesser things, if it lets people be concerned with lesser things, then a church is not a church. And the final thing he says is that the church must proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord's favor. And what that means is the year when God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. The year when God's kingdom comes in all of its fullness. When God's dream for humanity is fulfilled. And he said, some people see that in the future. Some people see that happening beyond history. But he says, I think that can happen right now. He says, I think this year can be the year of the Lord's favor if people will just do what is right. He said, whenever people live together as brothers and sisters, that is the year of the Lord's favor. He says, and again, he addresses this very specifically, and this is years and years ago. He says, when our theology is abreast of our technology, when our commitment to God, the formation of our life by God, runs ahead of our commitment to technology, our formation by technology. He's speaking to this decades ago. He says, this is the acceptable year of the Lord's favor. He says, when the end for which we live is abreast, runs ahead of the means by which we live, the things we give ourselves, this is the year of the Lord's favor. He says that when our morality keeps up with our mentality, when our commitment to be good keeps up with our commitment to know, to stay on top of information. He says when the nations of the world get together and they realize that if we don't stop war, if we don't end war, war is going to end us. This is the acceptable year of the Lord's favor. He says we must make this year now. And he says, again, speaking of this need to see greater things, he says that, and it's until people leave, a person has not begun to live until a person can rise above the narrow confines of their own individual concerns to the concerns of all humanity. Until we stop being preoccupied with lesser things, we'll never see greater things, and we'll never learn what it is to live. And then he goes and he concludes with this about God's judgment, and this is what we're going to conclude with as well. He says, this is how God judges people in the final analysis. Oh, there'll be a day The question won't be, how many awards did you get in your life? Not that day. It won't be, how popular were you in your social setting or on Facebook? Oh, wait, they didn't have Facebook back then. He didn't say that. How popular were you in your social setting? That won't be the question that day. It will not ask how many degrees you've been able to get. The question that day will not be concerned with whether you're a PhD or a no D. It will not be concerned with whether you went to Morehouse or whether you went to no house. The question won't be, how beautiful is your house? The question that day will not be, how much money did you accumulate? How much did you have in stocks and bonds? I hope you don't have much in bonds right now. The question that, he didn't say that, but I'm just saying that. The question that day will not be, what kind of automobile did you have? On that day, the question will be, what did you? What did you? What did I do for others? And then he says, now I can hear somebody saying, Lord, I did a lot of things in my life. I did my job well. The world honored me for doing my job. I did a lot of things, Lord. I went to school and I studied hard. I accumulated a lot of money, Lord. That's what I did. And it seems to me as if I can hear the Lord of life saying, but I was hungry, and ye fed me not. I was naked, and you clothed me not. I was in prison, and you weren't concerned about me. So get out of my face. What did you do for others? This, and this alone, is the breadth of life. Somewhere along the way, we must learn that there is nothing greater than doing something for others. And this is the way I've decided to spend the rest of my days. I hope I can live so well that at the end of my life, the preacher can get up and say, he was faithful. Yeah, that's enough. And the question I'd leave you with today, and the question that I'd leave myself with today, is in this choice between lesser and greater things. What will occupy your time, your vision, your energy? Are you? Am I faithful? Amen.